welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And if you've been listening in the last few weeks, I've been talking a lot about the British war in the Mediterranean, really North Africa, and the Balkans in 1941, and the basic disasters that occur when Britain becomes involved in Greece. You can skip back and listen to some of those. And really also the huge setbacks that Britain has after a very successful initial war in 1940-41 against the Italian forces in North Africa. Now we're going to focus on some of the mild successes that Britain has in the Middle East theatre, mainly in Iraq, in 1941, and the significance that these have towards thwarting Axis control of the Middle East oil fields. Iraq, as we know, was the product of the Sykes-Picot Agreement during the First World War that carved up the Middle East on the understanding that firstly the French, the British and the Russians, and then eventually just the French and the British would divide and conquer the Ottoman Empire. Obviously Syria and Palestine and Transjordan become part of that equation, but it's Mesopotamia, which later becomes Iraq, and that is uncontestedly a British mandate after the war, and by mandate we really mean a de facto colony. And the Paris Peace Conference and the development of commissions on mandates set the seal on this and this imperial carve-up of the Middle East. Iraq became an independent country in 1932, but the British retained the right, as all great imperial powers would have done, to hang on to military bases in order to protect the vital oil industry. As with Egypt, there were powerful pro-Axis forces in Iraq. Mainly these couldn't be described as fascist or Nazi, but simply Arab nationalists fed up with the British and wanting to find a rival power that could help force the British out. And in 1941, Rashid Ali, the nationalist leader who had Nazi sympathies, becomes the Prime Minister of Iraq following a military coup. And he thought that there would be an opportunity now to force the British out. The remote RAF airbase at Habaniya fell under siege from Rashid Ali's army, and now the Vichy French forces in Syria found an excellent opportunity to undermine the British in Iraq by using Damascus as a staging point for the Luftwaffe that had flown from Germany and had begun to shuttle military aid and equipment to Rashid Ali and his nationalist forces. I won't go into it here, but a book that you should get, which would give you the backstory to Anglo-French animosities over the Middle East, and would explain very neatly, though it is a very long discussion, why it was the French in Syria, Vichy and otherwise, sought to help unseat the British from Mesopotamia or Iraq. The book you should get is A Line in the Sand by James Barr. It's a really, really good piece of investigative history writing, some great archival research that shows the depths of animosity between the British and French over the questions of Syria, Iraq, northern Turkey, and also Palestine. If you consider the stretch of imperial forces now from Egypt and the Balkans all the way to the Middle East, and then if you imagine the forces that are dotted in quite a threadbare manner throughout Southeast Asia, in Malaya, Singapore, Burma, etc., you get an impression of how vulnerable the Middle Eastern oil fields actually were. Wavell didn't want to move any troops from Egypt, and he knew that if Rommel smashed through the Nile and seized the Suez Canal, the British Empire is effectively done for, and there would be a really short march across, a speedy tank race across Arabia from Sinai, and the Iraqi oil fields would be seized anyway. So moving troops from one front line to another didn't make an awful lot of sense. Churchill was insistent though, and so the port of Basra becomes a landing point for Indian troops, and a small number of troops from the Arab Legion march from Transjordan. These are a mixture of British essentially colonial troops, and Arab troops. And with the ability to still operate the airbase at Habaniya, the Iraqis are eventually defeated and the airbase was relieved. Very quickly, a pro-British government was installed, and Rashid Ali was removed from power. But the decision by the Vichy French to become involved in Iraq, and the interest that the Germans took in Iraq, which actually probably wasn't as great as Churchill thought. It was typical of the Nazis and the Nazi regimes kind of meddling at the peripheries of the British Empire to see what would give. Obviously, in 1941, Hitler's entire interest is focused on the Soviet Union, and that is where Hitler thinks that the oil will be accessed. It has only a fleeting interest in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. But Churchill becomes convinced that Syria is the kind of the weak spot of Britain's hold in the Middle East, and therefore launches a plan, or commissions a plan, to invade Syria. And here once again we see Churchill, kind of typical Churchill really, making assumptions that aren't based on any real prima facie evidence, and making policy on the hoof. It was probably completely unnecessary to have launched the operation to seize Syria, and the fighting is actually a lot more fierce than anything than Churchill had bargained for. After the sinking of the French fleet at Oran, at Merzeyres, and you can, I've done a podcast on that one some time ago, the Vichy forces were going to fight the British to the death. There was going to be no walkover here, and the British were going to be seen as hated enemies, far more loathed than the Germans in every way, shape and form. I suppose what you have to remember here as well is that France has been conquered and divided by Hitler into a zone of occupation and the fascist Vichy Republic, but a civil war continues, not in France but around the world, in France's colonies, in places like Dakar, which was invaded by the British and Gaullist French in September 1940, even though it was of little strategic use and value to the war effort overall. Well, there'll be further discussion in a later podcast, I think, on the complexities of this French Civil War that exists in the heart of the Second World War. But certainly it's not the only civil war that's fought during the Second World War. One needs only look to Greece and Yugoslavia, for example. On the 8th of June 1941, a combined force of British, Australian and Free French troops landed in Syria and Lebanon. British special forces, British commandos that were in really their infancy, landed on the coast in one of Britain's first successful amphibious landings of the war. But the fighting was fierce and they took heavy casualties. French heavy destroyers shelled British positions and then turned on the British escort fleet, inflicting quite some serious damage. The Vichy bombers attacked Britain's ships, and escorting fighters took down 3 British Hurricane fighters. And the overall impression on the first day was that this was not going to be like fighting the Italians in North Africa. The idea that simply because France had been defeated on its home territory, that the French were incapable of fighting was something somewhat of naivety, and also the idea that the moment that Free French Gaullist forces turned up, that there would be some huge change of heart on the side of the Vichy, and they would see the error of their ways in allying themselves with Nazi Germany. Again, was a misapprehension. The fierceness with which the Vichy forces fought the Anglo-French, Australian and Indian troops that were now marching on their positions tells us something. The pro kind of resistance, anti-German, anti-Nazi sentiment really becomes a mainstream discourse in France only in 1944, when A, the direction that the war is taking is pretty clear, and B, there is the scope to embrace these kinds of ideas. In reality, there were significant numbers of Vichy French who were comfortable with collaboration. They may not have liked the Germans, but they disliked the British even more. As Pierre Laval told the New York Times, France does not want to be liberated. She wants to settle her fate in collaboration with Germany. Now, taking Laval's point of view, taking Laval's words, is not representative of all French. I mean, he was particularly fascist and comfortable with a anti-Semitic regime, and it was guilty of signing orders to have French Jews sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. So perhaps not the most representative of voices, but also there were a significant number of French members of the Vichy regime and also French citizens who agreed with him. On the 16th of June, Allied forces came close to the outskirts of Damascus, and on that day the Fleet Air Arm used, the British Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm used Swordfish torpedo bombers, the type that had been used at Taranto against the Italian fleet, to sink the French super-destroyer Chevalier Paul off the coast of Beirut, and a Vichy submarine was later sunk with the loss of 55 seamen. The French reinforced themselves in Syria with aircraft and armour from their African colonies, and the ruins of Palmyra, where I have a photograph I keep on my desktop of British troops walking through the Roman ruins at Palmyra, which was originally at one point the easternmost part of the Roman Empire. The fighting at Palmyra raged between the British and the French Foreign Legion for 9 long days. On the 14th of July, Henri Dance, the Vichy High Commissioner, decided that the inevitable had come about and signed an armistice. But this was after 5 weeks of heavy fighting. There had been 1,000 Vichy soldiers killed, and the Allies had lost a roughly comparable number, with over 400 Australian troops, for example, losing their lives. The British particularly were outraged at the efforts that the French went to resist. The belief that the British had was that the French had no right to do this, as Britain was committed to liberating France from Germany. The brutality of treatment of prisoners, particularly, was a real bone of contention. The Vichy French were seen to have caused unnecessary slaughter by holding out to the last, and surely a simple surrender would have saved an awful lot of trouble for everybody. Well, the British assuming this meant that they weren't seeing things from the perspective of the Vichy French, obviously, and they weren't really taking into account the context of Mers el-Kabir, and also many French blamed the British for evacuating at Dunkirk. They believe was that the British were able to cut and run, having the luxury of returning to an island and leaving France in the lurch, and if they hadn't done that, then nobody would be in the mess that they were in right here and now. 32,000 Vichy and colonial troops chose to go to occupied France. 5,668 decided to join Charles de Gaulle, and General Georges Catroux, who had been sentenced to death in absentia by the Pétain regime for joining the Free French forces, was made the new plenipotentiary, the new viceroy, if you will, for the Levant, for Syria and Lebanon. Now, one thing that tends to happen when histories of the war in North Africa, or this less well-known war in the Middle East, are written, is that the Libyans, the Egyptians, and in this case the Syrians, are sort of edited out of the picture as if they don't really matter. And of course they were hugely involved in the events that unfolded, that had been colonised by the French. The French had used immense brutality to put down uprisings in Syria in the 1920s, and they had alienated the Syrian people immensely. And so the Syrians had some unenviable choices. It was unlikely that they were going to cheer the advent of a different French regime, and certainly they had immense suspicion of the British as well. However, there does not appear to have been the same degree of enthusiasm for Germany or Axis relations as there had been in Iraq. And the campaign itself was of questionable value, consumed a large number of resources. Churchill's generals were highly cautious on the subject, and as they were often when faced with some of Winston Churchill's flights of fancy. Sir Alan Brooke, I think I've quoted this one before, but Sir Alan Brooke said in his diaries that his job really was to shoot down the 9 terrible ideas that Churchill had every single day and focus on the one almost possibly okay one. However, the victory in Syria was not to be completely dismissed. It did give an indication that the British were still in the war, though for a great many people back home in Britain or in the United States, as we've talked about in the podcast in the last few weeks, a very important audience for Britain's wartime efforts. And even people in occupied Europe did spend much of the campaign scratching their heads, wondering quite why the British were pouring such efforts into Syria and why that might make any difference to the war. But the Middle East was now pretty much secured in British hands, and there would be, other than perhaps with Persia, which was to be partitioned between the British and the Soviets later on in 1941, there would be no further Axis threat to Middle East oil, and the ability to secure all of that in its entirety and use that to power Britain and later America's war efforts was no small achievement. Wavell found that his efforts in North Africa were going to have far less auspicious outcomes. For example, on the 15th of June, a new offensive operation, Operation Battle Axe, was launched, and this came to an unfortunate end rather quickly. A large consignment of tanks sent from Britain across the Mediterranean were destroyed by the German 88mm gun. And the existence of the 88mm gun throughout the war, and there's very little that can be done about it. It's essentially an anti-aircraft gun that is levelled down onto a horizontal as opposed to a vertical axis, and it could take out tanks from a significant distance away. Meant that Britain's progress within the desert was going to be fairly poor. Wavell, who was despised by Churchill, following Battle Axe, was quickly replaced by Claude Auchinleck, who was understood the Middle East and North Africa very well. And Auchinleck, placed at the head of the newly formed 8th Army, or the Desert Rats as they would come to be known, Alan Cunningham, who, as we know from a few podcasts ago, had been the victor in Abyssinia against the Italian forces there. Cunningham succeeded once again after a long lull in the fighting to race through to the beleaguered Australian garrison at Tobruk. This was after 5 months of almost nothing happening. Churchill was apoplectic with rage sometimes, demanding the set-piece battle in North Africa that would show the British public that the war was being won. Cunningham managed to outwit Rommel and relieve Tobruk. Rommel's counterstrokes and counterattacks failed, and he was forced to withdraw, losing 38,000 Italian and German casualties, the British suffering 18,000, and the loss of 278 tanks. The Germans actually lost more tanks in that campaign, so it says something about Cunningham, sort of the immensely talented guy. This was a cause for premature celebration on Churchill's part. He assumed that the Desert War was all but won, and he was going to be immensely disappointed. There would be another long year of fighting where the British would eventually be pushed back almost to Alexandria itself. The Germans and Italians understood this. In Max Hastings' All Hell Let Loose, he writes about the memoirs of one Italian officer, Lieutenant Pietro Ostellino, and he says, "I can only now take up this letter. Before, the English wouldn't let me. We're surrounded for 2.5 days by forces who were 100 times superior, with artillery that really hammered us, but we held out until reinforcements arrived, then put the enemy to flight. We captured prisoners and armoured vehicles. Of course, we too suffered painful losses. Please don't worry if I don't write you so often at the moment. The post can only operate every day." So this was going to be a continual elastic campaign, with one side overreaching itself and the other side taking the advantage, unlike what had unfolded in Syria. And it's really a kind of a product of the terrain and supply lines. And eventually the British would triumph, but it would take American help. It would take vast American resupply, and that would be how the Desert War would really be won. It wouldn't be a war really of manoeuvre and of anything other than a war of resources and a war of that is won and lost by mass production. Okay, so I hope you found this useful, and I'm going to continue with this. We'll be hopefully moving on to Operation Barbarossa pretty soon, so stay tuned for that. And thanks very much, everybody. Come and say hi at the Facebook page, Explaining History, and we're having some great conversations there. And I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Bye bye.